How are you all doing today?
Good.
Good.
Yeah.
Very well, thank you.
How are you?
Good. Good. Looking forward to the weekend. Nice. Hi, Ashley from Spain. Hi, Nigel. Good to see you again. Met yesterday or a couple of days ago at the FemTech Hub. Mike from California. Hello. Good stuff. Okay, let's slowly get started. So today we're talking about grants, specifically grants for female health and wellness startups. Topic of grants doesn't need a lot of introduction. Everyone is interested in where to find them, how to win them, and where to apply, where to stay on top of them. So we're gonna cover all of these pressing topics and also get some of your questions answered along the way. So as you're dropping in, just say hi and kind of mention where you're from, because that gives us a bit of a temperature check in terms of different geographies. For those that are new to FemTech Lab and new to our community, I'll just quickly explain what we do before I introduce the panel. So for those of you new to the community, we're a global platform for innovators in women's health. Our goal as an organization is to accelerate this amazing new wave of products in female health and wellness, and we're here to support the most disruptive, forward-thinking, cutting-edge founders and help those founders in women's health to take their products to market and raise funding. Twice a year, we run an accelerator program supported by now 200 world-class experts and over 300 investment partners. If you're here and if you're interested to apply, our next cohort starts on March 1st, and we're going to be opening applications in December and probably finalizing the cohorts already end of Jan, beginning of Feb. So make sure you head to our website and sign up to the waiting list to be the first one to know. So that's a little intro about FemTech Lab. Welcome to everyone that's new, and welcome back to those of you who have been attending our webinars. And now let's get back to discussing grants. And really excited to have really knowledgeable panel on the topic here today. I'm going to quickly introduce all three of these amazing women, and then we will dive straight into it. So first of all, we've got Debbie Taylor. Hi, Debbie. She's founder of Grant Starts. She's an experienced grant writer and reviewer, and she's had track records winning grants and in high-value grant applications and submitting successful applications from EU and UK both. Next, we've got Hatti Whitman. She's a senior, welcome. She's a senior grant specialist and Q&A review manager at Grantify. Some of you probably already know Grantify. It's an organization, a company that helps businesses to fund and scale using tech. Grantify has raised over £85 million in funding for startups. So quite a solid track record there. And Hatti personally worked on winning applications to UK and EU funding for various innovations. And last but not least, we've got Matilda Matthews, Innovation and Growth at Innovate UK EDGE. And together with the team, Matilda supports innovative businesses in bringing their innovation in UK and internationally. And quite a few of our alumni at FemTech Lab have actually recently won the Innovate UK grants. So special place in our hearts for Innovate UK as a result of that. So thank you all for being here. Structurally, I think it would be good to discuss the landscape of grants, like what's available, then to discuss a little bit how people can approach writing grant applications, and then any nuances to consider as completing applications, any sort of tricks of the trade or anything that maybe isn't obvious for people. I expect that there's going to be questions from the audience that are quite specific. That is very welcome. If you're here live, if you're attending, our goal is to answer your questions. So drop them in, ideally in the Q&A. It's a bit easier for me to track and weave into the conversation. So please drop that in there, and ideally provide like a sentence of context and a sentence, maximum 2 of your question. So again, it's a bit easier for me to weave that into the conversation. So with all that, let's get started. Debbie, I'm going to start with you. Could you just paint the landscape for grants in female health and wellness? Like if you're a startup in the space, what is out there? What's available? What should be sort of in your zone of view when it comes to grants?
Okay, yes, so not a small task.
Yeah.
But yeah, so first of all, thanks for this invitation to be part of this panel. I really enjoy helping startups in particular, and I find it really rewarding to see them develop and grow with grant successes as they get them. So my overall general advice in terms of finding and seeking grant opportunities would be to get strategically connected with local, national and EU support organisations, so they can do some of the hard work for you in terms of filtering out opportunities relevant for you and your sector, but also your region. So I'm going to go through a few of the different organisations on the EU level, but also then on a regional level. I appreciate it can be daunting to know where to start, particularly as a founder, you've got so many other things to do. And the landscape does constantly evolve as well. It's taken me several years working across both universities and SMEs to understand where all the pieces fit together. But I think I've got a picture now. But basically, FemTech as well is still relatively new. There are a couple of niche funders out there, but primarily it tends to fall between digital and the health sectors. So don't just look at health and omit digital, and vice versa. I think you need to keep an eye on both. But funders are also prioritising inclusivity more and more in their calls. So there could be some other sort of niche calls that are suited to FemTech. In terms of EU, like I say, focusing on supportive communities would be a good start. Particularly, some of these are mostly funded nationally or with EU funds, so they're mostly free to join these communities. And they offer networking opportunities, news updates, and obviously pointers to funding calls. And some also have their own smaller funding pots and accelerator programs, such as yourselves. So it also adds strength to funding applications to show that you've been proactively involved in these wider support programs rather than just going straight from cold to a grant. So I think Kate's going to put some links in the chat. But on an EU level, obviously the Enterprise Europe Network would be a good start to find partnering opportunities, but also this network has contact points for each country within Europe and also some non-Europe countries. So these contact points would be a really good port of call to make yourself known, introduce your business and what your interests are in terms of what you want funding to do for you. They can then open opportunities and doors and point you in the right direction for potential grant opportunities. Another opportunity more specific to health would be the EIT Health community. This is an EU-funded knowledge and innovation community aimed at boosting innovation in Europe and also partner countries. There's EIT Health and also EIT Digital. And EIT Health has a catapult that has an annual accelerator programme. The next one is opening in Jan 23, so maybe keep an eye out on that one in particular. And obviously for the UK, as Matilda will tell you, Innovate UK EDGE is the organisation to help you. So in terms of funding opportunities, again, I'm just going to throw information out there, and I'll be open.
Amazing, Debbie. This is amazing.
After, so you've got obviously European funding. I find is a bit more organised. No offence to UK, but they tend to operate in well-structured programmes that are defined. The calls are defined over a period of 1 to 2 years. So although the calls are generally bigger, they are you have more lead time to prepare and submit a sort of quality application towards them, whereas Innovate UK opportunities can pop up with like 6 to 7 weeks to the deadline, so you've got very little time to mobilise a big consortium potentially. So obviously, again, some links coming through. You've got the EU-wide funding and tenders portal, which is a beast of a machine. It's all of the funding opportunities out there across the whole of Europe. But there are some organisations, obviously the support ones I mentioned earlier, but obviously there's a health and digital executive agency that will filter through the calls relevant for the health sector. And there were also other sort of different funding streams, such as the European Innovation Ecosystem. This one in particular has an upcoming Women Tech EU call coming up in 2023. So another one that might be relevant for people on this webinar today. And obviously you've got the standard European, the EIC, the accelerators. These are really, really competitive, and they're just going to be announcing the new sort of call cycles for 2023 in the middle of December. I think there's a webinar coming up on that. And finally, some people may not be aware there's a Eureka pot of money as well that is sort of boosting sort of networks and innovation between countries across Europe. So you need to work alongside a partner country, but it does promote networking and sort of growth of market-driven projects. So that's on the EU level, and then just briefly on the UK level, obviously you've got the UKRI, which is the umbrella organisation under which Innovate UK sits. And particularly for FemTech, you've got maybe there's a knowledge transfer network for health that may have calls relevant and sort of updates relevant for FemTech, and they also have a funding map they put together as well. And similarly, in, like, for example, France, you've got the ANR, a similar sort of national funding support agency. In Germany, you've got the BMBF, and I'm sure all other countries have similar organisations at a national level to help support research and innovation. How they operate in terms of their funding and rates, all that will all differ. So just sort of check the small print. More locally, I would suggest getting in touch with your universities. Most have facilities and staff who are business facing, and they are all open and very much encouraged to work and promote innovative SMEs in particular. And finally, you've got maybe local authorities, municipalities that have small sort of business support grants on a really low level scale, but they maybe could help with travel grants or small equipment funding. So to summarise, it is worth spending the time to get to know the landscape relevant to you, your business and your region, and where your product is in terms of development. And it's useful to consider taking a strategic approach to your grant applications to build both your track record with grants and build your product or service. And just to finish with an example, a previous client of mine is a local health tech startup, and they used regional funding to access university facilities to test the feasibility of the idea. And they then used Innovate UK funding, the SMART grant, to take that concept and build it into a fully functional prototype. And then from that point, they were able to target successfully a themed Innovate UK call, which was the healthy aging, to help refine the product and build in a lot of user trials to finally take this thing to market. So it's a long journey for them, but it was rewarding.
Wow. I also want to ask maybe a little bit of a silly question, but so if you're a startup based in the UK, for example, is the EU funding available for you? Probably not. Or does it matter where you're operating? Like, from geography perspective, can you only apply for grants in your home country or where you're incorporated, or is it?
It depends on the funder. So to address the EU question, the UK is still eligible to apply for EU funding. There's an agreement between the governments to make that happen. So the UK government will underwrite any EU sort of guarantee of funding. But for Innovate UK, you have to be UK registered to apply for funding. So it very much depends on the funder.
Got it. Thank you, Debbie. This was incredibly helpful. Thank you so much. Matilda, Hatti, in terms of the landscape, are there any other opportunities that you would throw in for startups to look at?
Go ahead. Sorry. So just to speak to that very briefly, I think Debbie's given an amazing rundown of the landscape in Europe, and I'm sure that Matilda will have some specifics to add about the UK. Just to speak very briefly to the situation in the US, I think the biggest funding opportunity that anyone working with any sort of tech product should be aware of is the SBIR, which is Small Business Innovation Research. It's enormously targeted. They have divided their funding opportunities. You basically apply to a pot of money that sits with the National Science Foundation, but you can apply in very, very specific areas. And there's sort of 2 phases of funding available. So there's sort of support throughout several stages of your product's development. And very relevant for today, there is a specific digital health pathway open with the SBIR. So just want to point out for people joining us from the US.
Yeah, we have quite a few people from the US, I noticed in the chats. That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I also just want to kind of urge the importance of, joining any kind of mailing list in relation to grants. We constantly get sent updates through email and also through kind of expanding your network within LinkedIn. I know that, myself and other colleagues, we're constantly posting updates as they come through to us. So that's another way to, make sure you're keeping up to date just through, scrolling through your feed. I would say in particular, in relation to Innovate UK, there are a couple of grants that I think on the more, less niche, but still relevant here in terms of the SMART grant, which Debbie mentioned previously, which actually has a round open right now, which closes in January. And also that there are grants that run annually. So one in particular would be the Women Innovation Grant, which is targeted at women founders. And this is a grant of £50,000. So the round has closed for this year, but this will be open again next year. It's run annually once a year. And it's a grant of £50,000, which also has a support aspect to it as well. There are many opportunities also arising, as they're trying to make it more inclusive as kind of time goes on. But yeah, the SMART grant is one that runs roughly about 4 times a year, and there's a round that's open right now.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. Also super helpful. We already have a question regarding the landscape in the chat, so I'll ask it now. So regarding EU funding, the question is, do you know if women's health is going to be a strategic area, if there's going to be any funding specifically allocated for this? Is that on the horizon? Because someone that is attending said that they had a quick look and didn't find anything.
Yeah, I think if you're part of one like the EIT health community, for example, and you're part of those conversations, you're part of the events, part of the webinars, you'll get more of a flavour for what's coming up. So I would say, my experience generally is that the UK is kind of more the leader in inclusivity and diversity and sort of female leadership, and the EU is sort of catching up sometimes. So I think I would say there may be better opportunities on a more national level as opposed to the broader scope of Europe, because they've got so many priorities to balance in terms of what receives funding, whereas the smaller the pot and the smaller the organisation, maybe the more they can afford to prioritise up and coming sectors.
Yeah, do you both agree as well? Hatti, Matilda, does that sound right?
Yeah, definitely. I think when the EU sets its particular agendas, they tend to be a bit broader. So something, for example, like digital solutions for health does come up, but sort of basically making that more granular in terms of like particularly like FemTech, women's health, probably a little bit too narrow as a particular EU priority.
Okay, shall we move to actually writing a grant application? Right, I think we covered landscape really well. Thank you so much. I think people in the chat are already stressing about whether or not need to copy all the links because there's just so much useful information. This is really great. Thank you. So in terms of, when let's say you found something and you're about to start writing it, are there sort of general things off the bat that as a founder you should be thinking about when you start writing a grants application? Who would like to go first? Maybe Hatti?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what I would say is going to echo some of Debbie's thoughts about actually kind of like understanding the landscape. I think once you identify a grant opportunity that you think would be a good fit for you, the first thing to do with that approach is to just read everything you can, everything available to help you understand what that grant is, who can apply for it, and what you need to be showing in your application. Because something that we see a lot of at Grantify are people who, have got like a good kind of overall understanding, but pretty much any grant application, it's not just about doing something exciting, impactful, and clever. It's actually about the sort of overall business plan in a way that you're presenting to that grant body. It's going for grants is often, it's sort of seen as something that maybe you do before you go for investment, but it's very much kind of like pitching with the same sort of stringency, the same sort of detail, and the same sort of self-awareness as you would if you were going for private investment. So that's my first thing I would say, is like make sure that you find out as much as you can about the grant. I think one of the best ways to do that as well is to try and connect with people who know about that grant, so people who have previously won it. You know, in resources like Innovate EDGE, if you can speak to any of the advisors, like they're always just incredibly generous, like really, really helpful. And then obviously there are services out there like Grantify who sort of exist to help you up your chances, kind of draw out that information, point out the information that maybe it's not immediately obvious that you need to be including in that grant application. It can sometimes feel like you're almost doing like a sort of total sort of like autopsy in a way of your business, like trying to find out, you know, you often find that you're learning a lot about your own business as you go for a grant application. And I think having that attitude of wanting to kind of like learn, wanting to kind of like think through and plan things in a way that maybe you haven't before is just such a positive way to get started. Now, I think as well, obviously with my background working for a grant consultancy, the question that comes up is sort of when do you go it alone, and when do you maybe start looking for a bit of help with this? Mm-hmm. Now, I'd say if you're looking at a grant of sort of less than 50,000, like that may be an amount that's going to make an enormous difference to your business, but it probably means that it's not worth it to sort of, the outlay for a grant writer is going to be too significant there. But if we take the SMART grant as an example, that has an upper limit of 500,000 in project costs. So that's sort of like life-changing money. And it could mean that if a grant consultancy, you know, can make sort of 20 to 30% difference in marks is the kind of turnaround that we've seen with applicants who've come to us having maybe tried it on their own first time around and then gone in with our help. And if you think that sort of, you know, 20 to 30%, if you're investing maybe kind of around £10,000 once fees come in as a percentage of 500,000 overall, that's actually very, very minimal. So you kind of have to do that weighing up the value add for yourself. But I'd say, especially, you know, if you are feeling that you don't know what you don't know, and you are looking at going for an amount that's going to be significant enough to make that big a difference to your organization, it could be worth it just to have a preliminary conversation with, you know, with a grant consultancy, because it may be that even just on that sales call, you're starting to get an idea from the questions they're asking you about the sort of things that you don't know.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's super helpful. I mean, even just from personal experience, you know, you as a founder, one of the first things you create is a pitch deck usually, and it's a certain way that you present your business to also get funding, different kind of funding. But it's like you say, it's more about how innovative, the big vision, the big story. And then when you're actually applying for grants, like it's way more wholesome, so to speak, in terms of what you're actually talking about. And it's very different. It's almost like, would you also say that it's kind of also understanding the purpose of that grant, like as the funding body is putting that money into this budget, there are certain goals that is done with. So understanding that intention is important as well.
100%. I think if you look at the language that an awarding body use when they describe what they're looking for, you know, an example would be the EIC Accelerator is looking for kind of like deep tech. They talk about breakthroughs. They talk about market creating, market disrupting. It's those kind of like buzzwords that you really need to be sort of holding in your head as you start approaching it as well.
Gotcha. Thank you. Debbie, something you also wanted to flag when we were preparing for this is the different types of grants and kind of the cash flow aspects of things, and how certain ones may pay upfront, others later. And maybe Matilda, you can add in as well from Innovate UK perspective how that works. Could you maybe help unpack that? Because that, I think, for some founders is also not clear.
Yeah, sorry.
No, you go.
It's important just to understand when, like when Hattie said, definitely get in touch with the funders. I would suggest read through all the information first, and then that's like an opener to get in touch with the funder to clarify. And part of the clarification, not just on what's available, but how will it be delivered to you? What do the funders, some of them and some of the calls, so some of the calls give the money up front, some of them require you to spend it first before you can claim it back. So particularly if you're doing something with a high capital cost, as an early stage startup, you might struggle to come up with some of those initial investments to then claim it back. Also, some grants can, particularly EU grants, can come with additional overheads in terms of resources on your business to report, review, and send the financial claims in. So just be fully aware of what is involved in terms of the application, but also if you are successful, you want to help your business, not hinder your business. But yes. Sorry, Matilda.
Thank you. That's really good.
No, I agree. And I also, it's important to kind of note as well with that, with a lot of these grants, that they aren't 100% sometimes of the project costs. So some of these might be, 70% down to 50%, depending on kind of the size of the company. So you need to also kind of factor that into your cash flows on how you're going to cover the rest of that cost. Are you going to look at alternative finance options? Have you got, the money in the bank to cover that yourself? And again, what Debbie said in terms of kind of, whether you have to put the money up front, as a rebirth, you get reimbursed once the project is finished, or whether you get it in intervals as well. Some, if you're doing a project, let's say that's 36 months, it could be that you receive the grant funding at different intervals throughout that project duration. I also want to kind of echo what Hattie said as well, is that if you do find a grant that you find that you want to go for, especially with Innovate UK grants, a lot of them will hold briefings and kind of sessions, live sessions before these grants are kind of before the deadline, which gives you the opportunity to, have a Q&A, also meet other people who are going for the grant. That's another way for you to kind of grow, what Hattie was saying, your network, and speak to people who are also going through the same process, who might have also gone through that before.
Got it. And from Innovate UK perspective, for founders kind of UK based that are applying for this, what would be your kind of tips and recommendations for founders to make sure they're submitting an application that is aligned with the scope of the grant, or any sort of things you want to get out there that people tend to get wrong a lot and really need to get right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what Hattie was saying before, is really making sure you understand what the language is. So for a lot of the Innovate UK grants, they're really, focused on the wider impacts, how it's going to, how it's going to benefit society as a whole when, the business grows. So I think it's really just important to, understand what your project is and make sure that it does align with the scope of the project, of the grant, because, these grants do take a lot of time in terms of preparation as well. So you really want to make sure that if you're going for these grants, that it does align with the scope on that bigger level as well.
Got it. Any follow-ups on that as well?
I think that's, that all, it's like, you can't say the word enough, preparation, basically. It's such a mammoth task to undertake. Grants are typically extremely competitive. Obviously, the broader the reach of the call, so EU is much more competitive than a national call, for example. Women in innovation, less so, because it's, so the more specific you go, the less competitive it is, but it's still competitive. You still want to give it your best shot. So one word of advice from me would be to seek support early. I know founders have got a lot on and they think, I'll do it next week. And then you've got a week to go to the deadline and they realise what a big task it is. And then they seek help from external consultants like myself and Hattie. And also Innovate UK, they call them as well and ask them for help with grant writing. And 1 week is not enough time to put any kind of quality bid together. And even more frustrating is when I get calls to do reviews with 2 days to go to the deadline. And it's just not possible. I can do the review, but you cannot make those changes to make that difference to get it funded. So if you're going to invest in external support, make sure you seek that support early on so it can have its most effect. That's like the most frustrating thing, is having to say, I'm really sorry, I can't add value because it's too late.
Yeah, I mean, you probably hear it all the time as well, that, if you are looking for support and they say to you, spend 2 to 3 months kind of preparing for this application, especially when it is a really large, award. It sounds like a very long time, but these things do take a lot of time, and you really want to make sure that with some awards as well, you only get the opportunity to apply for that project a certain amount of time. So for example, the Smart Grant, you can apply twice with the same project. So you kind of don't really want to put all that time and effort into it, and waste to kind of try, so it's important to kind of take that into consideration as well.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that, even even if you're using an external consultant, like for example, we are working with somebody going for EIC Accelerator. So EIC Accelerator has cut-off points for its kind of like full application for throughout the year. One of the first things that Grantify do, it's almost like a service offering, is say, we'll have applicants coming to us saying, oh, I've seen that there's a cut-off in 3 months' time, and we're going, yeah, you need to look at the one in 6 months' time. Like, that's just the first step, is just kind of actually setting a realistic timeline for the amount of involvement this takes. I should also, it would be remiss not to say as well, hiring in outside help, I do think it's enormously valuable, and I do think that it can make a huge difference. It doesn't mean that you're not doing the application yourself. It still requires an enormous commitment, especially from a founder, but also from a wider team, because no one is going to know your project, your idea, your motivation better than you. And the best grant writer in the world can't put that across without like quite strong input from you and your team. So sorry, just a little point to get in there.
Absolutely. And I think it's those details that only backed up by facts, figures and references that add your voice to the application. So I think it is just because you're outsourcing it, don't just say, right, I've done that. So, you've definitely got a very important part to play throughout the process.
Thank you. We have a specific question for Smart Grant. How do you demonstrate technical merits of an innovation if you are very early stage and require the grant to create a proof of concept? Is it based on kind of predicted societal value? How do you demonstrate that, I guess, basically, when you're still early days for the Smart Grant?
Sorry, do you mind repeating the question? It cut off slightly there, sorry.
Oh, no worries. So for specifically a question for Smart Grant, how do you demonstrate technical merit of an innovation, which I assume is the requirement for the grant, if you are still early stage and you actually need the funding to create a proof of concept?
Yeah, no, with that, they know there's going to be an element of risk, and that's why you're going for grant funding as opposed to, let's say, equity investment instead. And I think it's important at that point that you've shown that you've conducted the right market research prior to the grant. You kind of need to find that level between you've done the market research, you've looked at the market, you've done your project planning, you've kind of looked at the thing as a whole, that you can execute this project. Let's say if you are awarded the grant, but also that they will understand there will be that side of technical risk, but you just got to make sure that you have looked at the whole picture and you've got put things in place to mitigate these risks as well.
And make sure in terms of what you're applying for, because there's different categories of funding with Smart as well, whether it's a feasibility study, industrial research, which is sort of TRL from concept to prototype, and then you've got the experimental development side, which is closer to market. So I'm not sure whether you're aware of TRL levels, technology readiness levels, but typically a lot of funders, it's where your idea or product or service is in terms of development. So whether it's just an idea, whether it's a concept that you've sort of proven, through to pilot, through to prototype, through to scale up and market. So typically for sort of SME funding, you'd be working within TRLs 3, which is sort of feasibility study to early proof of concept, through to TRL 7, which is pretty much just before market, so sort of pre-production prototype, that sort of thing. So it depends on where you are on that scale as well, and how much you're asking for. If it's that early days, you might not ask for 2 million, for example. You might sort of think about sort of breaking it into smaller parts and then staging, again, strategically approaching how you ask for grants and what grants you go to support you for whichever parts of the development you need.
I think that strategic approach is really important as well. As Matilda said, you can apply twice so if we're using Innovate Smart as the key example here, you can apply twice to Innovate Smart with the same project, but actually it might be, if you apply for that sort of feasibility study, complete it with the support of Innovate, it would be a different project if you're then applying for the sort of TRL 3 and beyond part of your project. So, you can get support at these different stages as well, because it would constitute a separate project. So as Debbie says, like being strategic, breaking down what you want to do into stages and approaching it in that way, being realistic as well about what you can achieve. Pretty much all of these grants will have time limits on how long it should be taking you to complete the work that you're saying you're going to do. One of the biggest things that we see in feedback is people being overly ambitious. So for example, taking something from maybe TRL3 all the way through to full commercialization within 9 months or something, which, you know, with the best will in the world would be very, very hard to do.
So it also kind of sounds, just I guess a clarifying question, which I think you kind of answered, around the stage that is sort of ideal when you're applying for grants. And would you say that it depends on the grant, and there's a landscape for different stages from very early to much later? So it really just depends on the grant and where you're applying. There isn't like a particular stage of a business where it makes most sense to focus on grants as your kind of funding route.
I would say usually grant funding is kind of considered the stage before equity investment. So that kind of when you have got that level of risk where, you know, traditional finance wouldn't, you know, usually come in at that point, like loans and equity investment. It is usually kind of at that point. It doesn't mean to say that if you've raised money, you know, you can't go for a grant. This happens, you know, a lot of the time. But it's usually kind of that before stage where there is that level of risk there, you know, that can kind of take away the risk, so that after you've had the grant and you've gone through the project, that, you know, other finance options can come in at that point as well.
And particularly for you know, maybe for the FemTech sector and particularly female founders, hence Women in Innovation, but Innovate UK, for example, or EU, it adds a stamp of credibility for future private investors to say, actually, it's been really competitively verified and validated to be, you know, really good potential. So it's more than just money, free money. It's a lot more than that. It's profile raising. Then, you know, Innovate UK, for example, have monitoring officers that then keep in touch with you, open up more doors for you. So it's a much bigger package of support rather than just the money.
Yeah. So a fun fact about Innovate UK, they often meet and have events at the FemTech at the same location where the FemTech hub is in London. Very, very fun fact to share. So very often when we have the kind of our open days and Tuesdays, there's like meetings or little reception events from Innovate UK EDGE. So there's a bit of a...
You'll also find that many of our advisors also work there as well.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I echo everything you say as well from kind of a founder perspective. It almost feels like there's always so much going on, and you're raising funding, you're managing cash flow, there's grants available. It's almost like having kind of being on top of things, and sometimes there's a grant opportunity that comes up that wasn't there before that you jump on, but you sort of almost need to stay on top of what's happening, and at the right time go all in and do it well, which is, you know, and I appreciate myself that it for founders can be a lot of resource management, but it could be game changing for cash flow.
Yeah, I just advise caution as well, though. Don't chase grants, because you'll find yourself getting distracted from your core mission ultimately, and you'll be bending what you do slightly, tweaking it to fit the call, and then before you know it, you've like lost what your core mission was. So just just be wary of that.
I love that comment. I think that's a very good advice. Absolutely, I agree with that. There's a question in the Q&A as well, which kind of relates to maybe team that is expected to be seen in the application. So it's actually an interesting question. What's the panel's view on solo founders? I have heard that you need to have a co-founder to go for funding. This is actually a common thing when you raise with investors. Investors say that it's better to have two founders. That's a bit of a thing that's set out there. Is it true for grants, I guess? What are your thoughts?
I would say it probably depends on the maturity of the business and the idea. If you are sort of, again, you know, to kind of go back to the previous question, if we're looking at something very early stage, and that maybe, this sounds belittling and it's not meant to, but it's sort of like growing out of being a pet project into something that maybe you're looking to expand further, then being solo might not necessarily be a huge barrier. What I would say is any grant is going to be evaluating the sort of capability of the team that are going to be doing the work. So were you to approach it as a solo founder, there is, you know, some budget within every grant to use subcontractors, but really they would be looking, anybody would be looking to see the necessary expertise and experience in your sort of core team. So if you were approaching it as a solo founder, I would say making sure that you emphasize the advisors that you have access to, maybe any mentoring that you've had previously, sort of demonstrating that you have the experience and have people that you can tap should you need to actually sort of draw in that expertise. I think as well, something that would be a motivating factor in many ways for going for grant funding is the ability to actually hire on the members of staff that you need in order to bring a project to reality. So lone founder it's not going to completely debar you from applying, but I think you need to be strategic about thinking about why you need the grant, and maybe it's kind of building out from that lone founder status.
Yeah, I'd also want to add as well that you also want to be able to, put across a promise and argument that you can execute the project, which can be hard with just one person on the team. But, also what Hatti said about you can factor in that you might be hiring through the process of the project, and planning out what kind of people you would be taking on board and why and what their roles would look like. That can be part of, the application process.
Absolutely. And I think it makes sense when you are at that earlier stage of those TRL levels that we talked about earlier. It maybe doesn't make sense at the later stages when you're about to go out to market, because like Matilda just said, you need those resources around to help support you. And also I think just make it clear that if you are the sole person on a project, what would happen if you were ill, for example, or unable to undertake your vital role. So often people do have some kind of backup, and you don't need to cost them into the grant at that time, but it's good just to mention how you'll be supported in the very unlikely chance that you are unable to work for any period of time.
It's similar to when you're going for investment. You want to give confidence that you are the right person to take on this project, or you've got the right people on the team to take on this project, and you want to give confidence to the assessor who's marking it. It's such a competitive process, and if you can get that across in your argument with just one person on the team, then that's amazing. But you want to give that confidence to them that the money is going to be executed, and the project's going to be a success.
Yeah, a lot of parallels there. That's so true. Another question, quite specific and I think quite good. Sometimes grants require the business to contribute a percentage.
Yeah.
Any tips or advice on how to navigate this when you have limited funds?
I would definitely recommend having these conversations start from early on. I've seen it a lot before where, a company gets awarded a grant and then they're last minute trying to raise these funds, and it's almost a nightmare. So I definitely, if you have these conversations going from when you're kind of originally looking at this grant, and being clear of what your options are. Are you going to look to speak to angels, or are you going to be able to fund this yourself? And if you are going down the route of angels or getting investment that way, then making sure them conversations are in place before you apply, and that you are able to, at that point when you get awarded the grant, that you are able to fulfill that side of the match funding, because it can get to the point, if you can't do that, that the grant will get taken away.
There are sorry, Debbie, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so the angel funding can be there, doesn't have to be there at the time of application. It can be there when you are notified that you are successful. So that can maybe help with some of the planning.
Yeah, there are also, as sort of, I would say more as a last resort, but there is loan funding available for specifically for sort of like high risk projects. So specific financing available. It does tend to be very high interest. I would say it's only really worth it if you're going for something that is very high value and also likely to see a high return in a short period of time, because you want to be able to sort of pay that loan off as soon as you can, because otherwise it's going to really dent your finances.
Also, maybe a little bit of again, silly question. I don't know why I'm couching this, but some of the grants, as you mentioned, like around cash flow. So it's sort of for you to first upfront cover your costs, and then the grant comes in as a reimbursement. If a founder wins that, what are the options there? Is it also kind of, should you be looking at angel investment, or is it also these loans that you've mentioned? Is that a good idea? Or is that actually something that usually the awarding body does not want to see when that's kind of the term of the grant? that it's a reimbursement type of grant rather than an upfront.
I'm not sure that the level of detail of where the funding is coming from through the company to cover the project costs is analysed by the funder. They just want to see that the money has been spent on project related activities. So and they obviously want to see that the match has come in. The actual sources of how that happened, I think, is not that important to the funder. Correct me if I'm wrong, Matilda, but I think you can do your own balancing in-house to make that happen. It's just the fact that the money has been spent on the eligible activities. That's what's key, and that the evidence of that fits with the funder's requirements. So whether that's invoicing or receipts or whatever, you just need to make sure that auditable trail is there of the expenditure and the match. But anything below that, I think that can be down to yourselves to manage.
Yeah, and I think again, it just completely depends on what the grant is. So it may work in the sense that before starting the project, you'll need to kind of prove that you're able to fulfill the project costs before being accepted. And then let's say it's, a 3-month project that you're able to fulfill, if you're working with an organisation, for example, this is one which happens like this. If you're working with an organisation like a catapult or research organisation, you're able to kind of pay them throughout the period of the project. And then once the project has been complete, that's when you can be reimbursed for the project costs. But at the beginning of that point, you would need to demonstrate that you will be able to fulfill the whole project cost, whether it's money in the bank or you've got the funds.
Got it. Okay. Another question. I'll throw in at you as well. It's an interesting one. I've been looking for a grant in Poland and CEE region, but was rejected 40 times. Can you comment maybe whether I think the founder is building an app that is related to people's religious needs? Could that be, I guess, like an issue when you're applying for grants?
Not if the market potential is there. It's so that you're evidencing market need. So if there's a definite or social or societal need, depending on, again, it all depends on the funder's priorities. Yeah. So maybe they're applying to the wrong funder, and maybe it's more of a charitable or a social enterprise funder that they should be looking towards rather than a business SME funding body. So if you're looking for SME and sort of innovation funding, it's all about exploitation potential and commercial viability. If you're looking for charitable funding opportunities, then it's all about social outcomes. So I would just question, what is the need for this, and what are the desired outcomes, and what will the impacts be, and is it better suited towards charitable or innovation activities?
When you're looking to demonstrate a need as well, having sort of quantified evidence, so being able to put kind of like numbers in front of your assessors is really important. I think something that I see a lot is people are able to make fantastic emotive arguments for why an idea or a project is sort of urgently necessary, but if you can't back that up with sort of hard figures, then it's often just not going to get across the line, because any kind of awarding body wants to see sort of pretty much hard facts about who's going to be affected by that, whether, as Debbie says, that's a sort of social outcome or more of a sort of industry outcome. It's sort of like who will be affected and how is like the really, really important question to answer.
Yeah. And maybe even like if it's certain communities in particular that are targeted, that is also obviously an important impact to be made. So maybe highlighting that but in addition to the kind of religion aspects of things, the types of communities that are being supported by this, maybe that aren't otherwise supported. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So in terms of resources, just to be also mindful for people to kind of walk away with as much like a list of things in terms of resources as possible. Is there anywhere else people can sign up to, I don't know, mailing lists or newsletters or anything like that, founders can kind of stay on top of what's coming up and what grant opportunities are available?
Yeah, so that is the UK, I'm not sure if it's been put in the chat already, the UKRI funding page. You're able to join the mailing list there, and you get emails and updates come through that. You can see upcoming grants through Innovate UK, which are available and upcoming. That would be, I say, the main point that I'd, you know, start with there for Innovate grants in particular.
Yeah, anywhere else?
I think there was a link already to the Europa website, where again you can sign up for sort of news and updates, especially from the EIC, the European Innovation Council as well. So things like, as Debbie mentioned, the briefing that's going to take place in December for the sort of next year programme of EIC funding, really good to sign up to. I think not sure how relevant this comment will be for the next kind of few weeks, but following all of these organisations on Twitter as well, you tend to see news and updates on there. But yeah, not sure how long that's going to be true for. And I'd say also signing up to, even if you're not looking at a US-based grant, I'd say signing up via the NSF website that has been shared in the chat as well. They send out really great sort of like tips and tricks for grant funding every so often too. So just great to keep an eye on the landscape.
And what about, we haven't mentioned anything in Australia. There was one question I haven't asked. Any opportunities that you know of in Australia or Asia Pacific region by any chance?
I haven't covered Australia much, so I'm not
outside the scope
really
of this webinar, maybe next one.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Last question, if that's okay. Is it advisable to include some cost in budget for evaluating impact and outcomes, or is it just expected and shouldn't be included in the cost?
And that would depend on the call specifically. I think that's actually, you know, that is a good activity to include if you can. Some people struggle because the project costs are already creeping up, so they're trying to look as to where they can bring it down to fit within the core limits. But check with what is eligible, and if that is, then I would definitely say it would be a good thing to do, because you're then costing for the activity to actually evidence the impact that the funding has had, which is what funders want, is basically metrics to show their funding has achieved what they set out to achieve.
Yeah,
I think that a lot of grants as well, they will expect you to put together kind of actually a project plan. So, you know, breaking down what you plan to do over the course of the project into sort of tasks and deliverables. And within that, I would normally expect to see some sort of, if analysing your impact is part of the ongoing work, then I would definitely expect to see tasks and deliverables within your project plan. And that would have probably just a proportion of your overall labour costs, to be honest. It wouldn't be sort of specifically costed, but that would be how I would see it.
Yeah. Okay. We're sort of approaching the end of the hour. It's been super useful. Maybe as we wrap up, I'll just ask if there's anything else at all that you wanted to share, any last tips, any last lessons learned, any final takeaways that you want people to really go away with today.
Yeah, I would say just to definitely make use of the resources which are available, you know, whether that's, you know, support through, you know, if you're a UK-based company, through Innovate UK EDGE, which offers support in, you know, a range of business areas, one being grant funding, but also to look back, there's videos online to help, you know, through different grants. So on YouTube, I know there's from previous grant awards, there's lots of videos on kind of tips and tricks, and also, you know, experience from people who have won and kind of have them sharing their stories. Definitely making use of kind of, you know, the resources that are available, and also, you know, expanding your network as much as you can. You know, I mean, LinkedIn is such a good tool, you know, to speak to people, whether that's, you know, people you're asking for support or people who may have won an award and you want to talk to it. You know, people are really helpful. So definitely just making use of what's available out there. A lot of it's free as well. So
yeah.
I would just say, don't be disheartened by rejections. See rejections as opportunities, because often they do provide detailed feedback on why it's not quite been funded. And sometimes some of my clients, for example, come to me once they've had a rejection for support, but actually then the second time around, it's a evolved application. So actually the rejection has helped fine-tune what they wanted to do and how they were going to do it. So don't be disheartened by rejections, see them as opportunities.
I think I'd echo that as well in just the process of applying. See the application process as the exercise that it is. Like, it's an enormously valuable piece of work for your business, essentially, and for your understanding of where you started from and where you want to go. I think even just working on a grant application like this, sometimes you'll evolve your project during the course of the application, because you'll just sort of get to the point where you really understand what it is you want to do. It's an amazing piece of kind of self-evaluation work as well.
Yeah. Okay. Really, really valuable. Thank you so much. So many insights, so many links, so many, I think, really amazing lessons learned. Thank you. Thank all three of you, Hatti, Debbie, Matilda. This was incredible. And for everyone that's attended, we hope to see you at our future webinars. Hope this was valuable, and stay in touch, and have a good rest of your evening, everyone.